Welcome back, and following up on our previous video which dealt with the user interface inside of Blender, today we're going to be talking about viewport navigation tactics and understanding some basic 3D terminology. So let's jump right into it. So we can see here that we are in our modeling workspace. As per the last video, I just picked up right where we left off, so everything's the same. It should be the same for you. And we need to talk about understanding how to get oriented in 3D space and understanding how to move around our viewport. I think that's rather important. So for my purposes, I will primarily be using a 3-button mouse. Now, for those of you who don't have that available to you, of course, reference the first video I recorded where we can kind of emulate that with the Alt button added in with the left mouse click. However, it's not really necessary anymore. There are ways to kind of get around that, and I'll show you that now. So the normal way to use this, let me just make sure that my screencast keys is on, and it is. So I'll just toggle that shut, and you'll see that you can get the shortcuts there in the bottom corner, whatever I'm pressing. You can also see anytime I use a mouse operation, it tells you that I'm pressing, the middle mouse button, for example. So I use the middle mouse button, and this is by default in Blender, of course, to orbit around our scene. So we have a 3D object, we want to move around it and view it from multiple angles. Just click and hold your middle mouse button for that. The other operations that we can do are we can zoom in with our scroll wheel. And then the last one, of course, is I can pan around by holding down Shift and clicking and holding the middle mouse button and moving around the scene. The last operation is if you don't like the kind of incremental snapping of the zoom with the mouse wheel, you can actually hold down the control key and click and press your middle mouse button to zoom in and out. Now, of course, if you're using the emulate 3-button mouse option, you will have to include the Alt key with these operations. So for those of you looking to orbit inside of the window with the Alt operation or the modifier turned on, you will hold down the Alt key. And here, I can show you really quickly just to make a demonstration of it. Go to Preferences, go into Input, and turn on Emulate 3-button mouse. Let me just throw this to the side. And now you can see if I hold down the Alt key and left click the middle mouse button, you can see that I'm orbiting around my scene. And then if I hold down Alt with Shift and left click, it allows me to pan. And then if I hold down Control and Alt and left click, it allows me to zoom. So for those of you who want to emulate a 3-button mouse, that's available to you. That's how you would do it. Oh, there goes Blender. It just minimized itself. Let's open that back up again. All right, and now I can turn this off. So the reason why that happened, by the way, is in Windows, if you have a window open and you accidentally shake it, it will minimize everything except for that specific window that you were shaking. So that's what happened there, in case anyone was wondering. I don't want to have to recut this whole video just for that, so, maybe that's something useful to those of you who want to figure out where your desktop is on a Windows machine. Anyways, let me make sure that I turn that off. I did. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that. But essentially, if you don't want to emulate that and you don't have a 3-button mouse, you can actually use this little Gizmo Widget thing up here in the right-hand corner. And this is actually a really useful tool that will allow us to do a number of things. So if we click and drag on this, you can see it'll actually allow us to orbit around our scene. Now, it can get a little snappy in certain places, if you notice there, so just be aware of that. And we're going to talk about orienting ourselves in 3D space and what it means to do that. But essentially, just know that if you don't have a middle mouse button and you don't want to emulate one, you can simply just left click and drag this little option here, which is really nice. So this is something that's kind of new to Blender 2.8 and above, so just keep that in mind. Let me open up my recording software on the side and make sure we're still good to go. All right. Now, the next thing that we need to look at is some of these buttons on the side. And these are for, again, those of you who don't have a 3-button mouse but still want to afford yourself that usability. So before, I would always recommend having the emulation options on for those of you who don't have a 3-button mouse. Now it's not really mandatory because we have these options available to us. So this one here, of course, is zooming. So you can simply click and drag on this and zoom. You can also pan with the hand tool here. So it's really nice to have these available to us. Now you'll notice it is a little bit snappy and I kind of went off the screen there and it's like, where did my stuff go? Okay, I have to get back over there. If for any reason your viewport just kind of snaps like that and you lose track of everything, another way to kind of orient yourself is under the view option and saying frame all, and it will frame your view around everything in your scene. Or if you want to get really specific, you can also say view and frame selected. And the shortcuts for that are the home key and the number pad period key for those of you who have a number pad. So if you don't have a number pad, you're probably going to have to use this option over here. And so we can click that and you'll see our screen will zoom right into whatever object we have selected, which is really nice. So that's a way that we could use our outliner. So let's emulate that again. Let's say we've lost track of everything in our scene. Let's say I want to find where my light is. I can select my light in the outliner and I can go view and then say frame selected, and my view will snap right over to that light. So that's a very useful way for finding your bearings about you in 3D space. So keep that in mind. So yep, we do have these settings over here on the sidebar. Now these last two are a little more complicated to explain. The camera, of course, if we click that, it will snap us into the view of our camera. This is actually the view that Blender will take at the time of creating our final render. So if I go over here and hit render, you don't have to do this if you're following along with me, by the way. I'm just going to show it to you. If I hit render, you'll see it'll open up a new window and it will create a render of the cube. And if I were to minimize this, I'm going to try not to shake that again. If I minimize this and kind of scroll back, you can see that it's actually got the same perspective as what we're seeing in the viewport. The only reason why the viewport's different is because our current view mode in the viewport is called solid shading, which is not the same as our render. We do have a render preview mode though, and we'll take a look at that shortly, but let me get through viewport navigation first. So I'm just going to close this and I'll use my middle mouse button to kind of tumble out, and you can see that we just came from the camera view. And so we can kind of toggle that here, or if you hover over it, it'll tell you that the shortcut is the 0 on the number pad. Now the last option we have available to us is probably the most complicated one to explain, and it's a toggle between orthographic and perspective view. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. It's mapped to shortcut number pad 5. And essentially there are two different ways to look at objects inside of the 3D viewport inside of Blender. By default, we have a user perspective view, which mimics the way that we see things in the 3D world as human beings, because we've got two eyes. And as such, there's foreshortening and there's occlusion where objects overlap. And so there's perspective where things recede into the distance, and we have vanishing lines and things like this. And so that kind of emulates the way that works in 3D. And we can kind of break this in 3D if we want to. Of course, we're not going to do that for this tutorial series, but essentially there are ways for us to mimic that and get a feel for it. But however, when we want to get more technical, perhaps, there's a way that we can switch to a different mode called user orthographic. And essentially what this is like a flattened out view of everything. It's similar to isometric view. For those of you who are familiar with isometric art, you can see that it's got a similar quality to it. There really isn't any foreshortening anymore because everything's being viewed from its flattened out perspective, I suppose. It's not really perspective real anymore. And this can be useful for kind of assessing the profile of our object and working from various angles. I would not suggest working exclusively in orthographic view because it's not really going to be what you get when you do your final render. Although there are ways to force Blender to render in an orthographic view if you need one. So for example, if you're creating 3D objects and you're doing it for the purpose of a demonstration in a drafting demonstration, for example, to show your objects in orthographic view can be really useful for that. And there are ways to kind of force Blender to render out in that mode if you so choose, and it has to do with our camera and our render properties, and we're not really going to get into that right now, but just know that the two different view methods that we have inside of Blender are perspective and orthographic, and we will primarily be using perspective. We'll look a little bit at the orthographic. Now, before we get any further, just know that there are kind of preset view configurations that we can toggle through inside of Blender. Now, without getting too complicated and explaining all the keyboard shortcuts, I'm simply going to direct you to the view panel here and say, look under viewpoint, and you can see you get all the different views here. So you can look through the camera, you can look from the top of the scene, the bottom of the scene, the front, the back, the left, and right, and there are all the keyboard shortcuts for that. Now, personally, I have them memorized in my head because I use them regularly, and they're mapped out to the number pad on the keyboard. There are also different methods for navigation. So again, if you don't have a 3-button mouse with a middle mouse button that you can use to orbit around the scene, you can kind of incrementally force them using the number pad options here, which are all the even number pad options. And these are actually kind of logical the way they're laid out if you actually look at the number pad. Some of the number pads even have arrows, and you can see like 4, for example, is on the left side, and that orbits us to the left. 6 is on the right side and it orbits us to the right. I even have little arrows on my number pad keys that kind of indicate that to me as well. 9 will orbit the opposite. So any view that we take, it will invert that to the opposite side. So if I click that right now, you'll see it snaps to the other side. And then if I press 9 on the number pad, it'll flip me right back. So you have a lot of options here for trying to figure out how to orient yourself in 3D space. There are a ton of options here. And there are some even different types of navigation that you can look at in terms of how to get around your workspace. Essentially, though, we're just going to be sticking with the number pad, and I will call that out. So again, it's kind of laid out in a sensical way, but it can be confusing at first. So 1 is the front, 3 is the right, 7 is the top. And then, of course, if you add in the control keys, it will kind of flip that. So back, left, and bottom. So yeah, it takes a little bit of time to get used to that. And then, of course, if we middle mouse button, we can kind of tumble out of it. But that's just something that kind of comes with the territory. So again, refer to this menu here if you need to until you can memorize the actual key presses. Again, I will call it out when I do it, or you'll have the reference from the add-on there in the bottom left-hand corner where you can see what I'm pressing. Now, the last thing is, if you don't want to go through this menu and you don't want to use the keyboard, note that this widget here, if you hover over any of these dots, you can actually see that you use a preset viewpoint for the front. That's what this one is. I think they should add a thing that tells you that it's for the front view. But essentially, if you click it, it will be the same as if you press number pad 1, and you'll end up in a front orthographic view. So that's what those keyboard shortcuts are doing, is it's forcing an orthographic view. Again, you can toggle it if you press the 5 key. So for example, it changes there. But essentially, the primary one that I use is probably front and right. Sometimes I'll invert it based on what I'm doing, but just know that those are the shortcuts and those are what we'll be using. And this little gizmo right here, very, very handy. Very handy. The other thing that this is really useful for is just orienting yourself in 3D space. So here we're going to get into some basic 3D terminology that I think is important for us to understand as we're working in 3D. So obviously, when we're working with 3 dimensions, we're going to have 3 dimensions. Again, it's very obvious, but let me explain. We have 3 axes, which represent the 3 different dimensions that we're working in. So we have the red x-axis, which is the first one, the green y-axis in Blender. Now, keep in mind that this is not always going to be the case, but the green y-axis in Blender represents forward and back, X represents left and right, and Z, which is the final and third axis, represents up and down. In other 3D applications, sometimes Z and Y are flipped. So sometimes Y is the up axis and Z is the forward and back axis. It's not like that in Blender. And these are called left hand and right hand coordinate or grid systems. I'm not going to explain what that means because it's not really necessary for what we're doing. That's if you have a real deep love for 3D and you want to know all the crazy terminology about how things work in Cartesian math and Cartesian grid systems and things like this. We're not going to get that deep. We just need to understand that the red x-axis when we're in Blender means left and right. The y-axis means, which is green, and it's typically always color-coded like this, so y should always be green, and x should always be red, and z will always be blue. Even in other applications, just note that in other applications, the z and y-axes might be flipped. They'll be the same color, but they will generally be flipped in other applications. So anyways, in Blender, the left and right movement or transformation is going to be the x-axis, which is red, so you can see it running here. And the way to orient yourself is if you press the 1 key to get a front view, you can see that you're looking at this left and right moving axis. Let's just tumble out of that. The green y-axis is forward and back, and then the blue z-axis is up and down. Now you may be wondering to yourself why the blue z-axis is missing from the scene. And the reason for this is it's pretty standard in most 3D applications to hide it, simply to keep it out of the way. So we don't have too much on screen happening at once that we get disoriented. But the way to find this in Blender is if we come over here to our viewport overlay options and kind of toggle this down, you can see our axes of X, Y are turned on, and then we can also turn on the Z axis if we want. It's not really necessary, but I like to turn it off because if I use my shortcuts, the number pad 1 key, for example, you'll see it will appear in an orthographic view. So the nice thing about the orthographic views is it completely flattens your view, so you're only working with 2 specific axes at a time. you can see that we don't really see Y because it's technically heading straight into our view. I mean, you can see that here, it's completely flattened out because we're only dealing with the Z and X axes. And so that makes doing certain transformations from an orthographic perspective a lot less complicated than trying to figure it out in a perspective view, because in perspective we have to deal with all three axes, whereas in an orthographic view we're only dealing with two at a time. So that makes things a little bit easier. So now that I've explained that, I want you to take a little bit of time to just get used to the viewport, get used to navigating around, panning and zooming and orbiting, and then of course, using these options here if you need them. I personally don't use them because I think it's faster to work with the mouse. But for those of you who need this or want this, again, just remember that these are all available to you. And so just take a minute to pause the video and kind of play around with it, get a feel for it. You can also do a little exercise where maybe you can explore the custom configuration of the layouts. If for any reason you do mess something up, just remember under the File menu, under Defaults, you can always load your factory settings. Just keep in mind that you may want to save your file before you do that, because Blender will reset itself. You may also need to go back and configure the things that we set in the preferences in the first video if you revert to your factory settings as well. Also keep that in mind. So go ahead and pause the video, play around with it for a little bit, get your bearings about you, and then we'll resume in a moment where I will begin to talk about how to make transformations according to these three directions. All right, so assuming you paused the video and went ahead and did that, let's continue on to talking about transformations. So while we're in object mode, if we have our cube selected, we can do what's called a transformation. So if I open up this side menu here and select the item tab here, you can see we've got transformation. I can also access this in the properties editor with the object properties tab. So these will reflect each other. We'll leave them both open for now. So of course I can move things in 3D space. So if I drag this here, you can see I can move them. I can also type in decimal points. I think they've changed Blender so that it uses meters and centimeters, which of course makes sense, but sometimes I like to just type in 2 point, whatever. So 2.4 meters, for example, which is 2 meters 40 centimeters. So however you need to work with that, it's completely up to you, but essentially this is reflecting movement on the grid. So if we take a look at the grid, we know that by default it's set to meters, which I mentioned in the previous video, and you can see that we've moved this cube over 3 meters in the X direction, or the X axis. Now I can also zero this out and return my cube to the center. So the center coordinate of the 3D world, of course, is 0, 0, 0, and you can see that here. And then the way that we move our objects is based on what's called an origin point. This is also known as a pivot in other 3D applications, for example. So the pivot or the origin. It's indicated by this little orange dot or this little yellow dot in the middle of our cube. And that's basically what's reporting the location of our object. So if I hit 3, you can see that it's moved 3, but it's centered in our cube because the origin for our cube is dead in the center of it. We can actually change this later on for more complicated movements, and we may look at that a little bit later, but just know that when we move this cube, it's moving according to this reference point in the center of it. So if we want to get that reference point to a corner to give it more specificity, we're going to have to tell the origin how to move. And the way that we can do that is if we right click, we can say set origin, and we have a number of different options for setting them. Again, this becomes a little more complicated, so we're not going to set that right now. We're just going to leave it by default, but just know that that operation is available. Now, if I want to return this cube back to the center of the world, I can actually click and drag over all three of these values and type 0 and hit enter, and you'll see it zeroes itself out. So location is basically just moving and sliding our object around. It's also known as translation, to translate it from one location to another. And so you'll see that in other applications. The accompanying tool for that is called the move tool. If we click that, we'll get this gizmo over the top of our cube that allows us to move in various directions. And you can see that this location will, of course, update itself according to our translations or our transformations. And you can see that I can move it in all three directions and get values for that, and then I can zero this out. The nice thing about this gizmo is that we can also just kind of click in the center of the circle here once we have the cube selected, and we can move it, and that will move according to our actual viewpoint. So if I were to change my view over here, obviously it's going to move in this way. So it is moving in all 3 axes, but it's kind of constraining that according to the view that I'm in right now. So if, for example, I go to a front view orthographic, if I were to use the circle option, I'm only moving really in the X and the Z axes. I'm not moving really much in the Y axis. Although it may show some minor value changes in here because Blender is not perfect in that sense, it would be more accurate for us to go in and actually type in the values that we want, of course. But essentially know that it's approximating that. So you see it'll flip between 0 and -0, which is, of course, there's no 0 and -0. It's just 0. So just keep that in mind. Using orthographic perspectives or an orthographic view will actually give us only movement in 2 axes. So it's a way to better get control over your objects. So I'm just going to select these and send it back to the origin, or the the world origin, which is 0, 0, 0, and then we'll move on. We also have these other handles here that allow us to constrain into axes by default. So this green one is going to omit the Y axis and only allow us to move in the X and the Z directions. And then we can do that here as well. However, we're now omitting the X axis. And then the last one is we're omitting the Z axis. So that's a way to kind of get some additional control. And then the last way to kind of move things or translate them specifically, is the transformation that we're doing here, is the G key on the keyboard. We can do that. And then there are a number of ways that we can constrain this. So obviously just moving it around like this isn't all that useful. So we can constrain to various axes. So if I only want to move it in the Z axis, I can tap Z. If I only want to move it in the X, I can tap X. And if I only want to move it in the Y, I can tap Y. And so that gives me some options there. There are also some snapping considerations. So if I hold down the control key, as long as these snapping options at the top of the window here, you can see where my cursor is hovering. Above, you can see this magnet and the snapping option. This gives us a little more precision, so you can see it snapping by various increments. It's easy to mess these settings up, so I would suggest leaving them default for now until we look at them later. But essentially now I can move this by increments instead of, decimals, floating point decimals. So that's something that's available to you. With the G key activated, for example, you'll see it's still attached to my mouse. Once I'm happy with the location, let's say I want to move it 6 meters on the Y axis, I can simply left click to accept that operation. And then if I did another operation by hitting the G key and constraining on Y again, and I want to cancel this, I can either press escape or right click and it'll snap back to its original location. That same thing will actually work when you're using the gizmo. So again, if I don't want to do this, I can simply right click or hit escape and it will snap it back to where it was. So just know that there are various keyboard shortcuts and ways of controlling this thing. For example, if I want to omit an axis, like I showed you with the gizmo, if I hit Shift Z, I'll omit the Z, and then Shift X, I'll omit X, and then Shift Y, I'll omit Y. So there are various ways to use the keyboard shortcuts to kind of like constrain the way that you work in 3D space. That's the way I prefer to do it because I've memorized all of that. But again, for those of you who are new to this and don't really know it, you have the gizmo that's available to you. It may take a little bit longer to do things this way, and it's perfectly valid to do it this way. It's just not the way I prefer to do it. So feel free to experiment with what works best for you. The last thing I'll show you also is with the G key, if you click and hold on the middle mouse button, you can actually constrain on axes. But I don't find this as useful because it's easy to kind of snap to the wrong unintended axis and move things in ways you don't expect. So I will just tend to use the actual Z key itself to make sure I have the right one. So just another little tidbit there. Moving right along, we have rotation. So again, we can do that here in the menu. And I'll start to move a little bit faster now so we don't spend too much time going over this basic info. And then of course you can rotate using the handles here. And then if you actually click within this white circle, you can actually rotate according to your view. And then there's also ways that we can rotate according to a trackball rotation. And as you could probably assume, the rotation hotkey is actually just the R key. And then if you tap the R key twice, you can also do trackball, which is a different type of rotation, but is also kind of useful. So again, you have that available to you. You can select all this and zero it out. Now, there's not really a good way to rotate on 2 axes at once. And honestly, I don't know why you would want to do that. Because rotations are very specific and there are some limitations about it. So for those of you who are familiar with like complex computations for rotations in 3D scenes, we actually have different rotation modes. We're just going to leave it on the XYZ Euler by default. don't worry about this if you don't know what I'm talking about right now. It's much more complicated mathematical stuff. And honestly, I don't even deal with this when I work in Blender 90%, 99% of the time, I should say. By default, the rotations that you'll get out of it are exactly what you need them to be. And we can just, set them in menu if we want to be specific. So let's say I want to rotate this 45 degrees in the y-axis. This is something important to explain. When you're rotating around an axis, it's going to be a little bit different than locational translation, for example. So when you move it in the Y, you're moving it back and forward. When you're rotating it, you're actually rotating it around the axis. So you can see here that the cube is being penetrated by the Y axis here, and you can see it disappearing through the surface of it. And essentially what we're doing is we're rotating it around that axis. So you can kind of think of the cube as kind of hugging that axis, and you're going to spin it based on its relationship to that axis. So just keep that in mind. It can be a little confusing at first, but you'll get the hang of it after you do a couple of these operations. Now the last one that we have is scaling, and that's going to allow us to kind of squash and stretch in various directions. So you can see here I can just, once I've clicked on the gizmo, I can kind of drag it. There are also additional, like a scaling cage, for example, which may be useful for some of you out there, which allows us to kind of move the various faces of the cube. I honestly don't use this all that much, and this can kind of create some problems. It shouldn't be too bad, honestly. This actually behaves more or less as expected. But yes, okay, so here's the problem, is that when you move some of these faces with the cage version, you can see now that our pivot has kind of moved from the center there. So I would have to reset my scale back to 1. So scale is another interesting thing. You can't set it to 0, otherwise your cube's not going to have any volume to it. You must set it to 1. That's the default scale. And then I need to set my location back to 0. So let's select all this and set it to 0. And you'll see that as I kind of use this cage scaling, it's a little strange because it moves the location as well as scaling the object. So this can be useful for certain things, but it can also get you off a location. So I tend not to use this. I would prefer using the scale option here. Although I use the scale hotkeys, and then of course we'll look at actually manipulating the 3D object, which is going to give us similar results to this pivot being, well, the pivot's going to stay in the same location as long as we don't move things in object mode, or unless we set them later on at a later point. So the weird thing about this cage that you need to know is that when you scale according to the cage, it's going to change the location of your object in 3D space. So here you can see that the origin point for the cube is actually moving according to those translations that we're doing. So although this is helpful, just keep in mind that it is going to affect both your location and your scale. So for our purposes, let's simply play with scale. So of course we can kind of set these settings. Let me just switch this back to the regular scale tool. We can kind of set these settings, and you can see that when we do this now, our location is staying in the same place, and we can kind of stretch out our cube, and it will also change the dimensions. So a good thing to note here is that the dimensions of the cube describe the actual dimensional bounds of the cube. The scale is a ratio. So if we want it to be twice as wide in the x-axis as any other part, we can simply type 2 there, and you'll see that our x dimension will become 4. So it's not that the scale is a direct measurement of what's happening. It's a ratio of how we're changing it. And of course we can kind of use these options here. We also have the 2-axis scaling as well, which gets kind of funky, but can still work. And then the last thing is with the circle, if we click it, we can scale the whole object, and you can see all of that's changing. So again, I will simply come in here and reset this all back to 1. Now the interesting thing about scale and rotation is that you can actually apply them. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at rotation, let's say I want to rotate my cube like this, and you can see that we have rotational values here. And I'm going to do something to break this. I'm going to say don't do this. You that follow, if you're following along with me, don't actually do this. Just watch for a moment. So let's say I give it a rotation, and I want to make this the default rotation for my object. I can hit Control A, which brings up the apply menu. You can also do this in object apply there as well. I prefer the Control A menu, and I can actually apply my rotation so that this is zeroed out. And you can see that it Now this is not so helpful because the cube is not properly oriented in 3D space. So maybe you need it to be this way. Some people may find this useful for particular things, but you'll notice now that my rotation gizmo is aligned to the axes, and however the cube itself is not. And there's really no way for me to get this back. Okay, it's not true that there's no way, but it's difficult to get this back to its restarting location. And a lot of people will find that it's probably easier to just delete this and create a new cube. So just note that you can actually apply object transformations and it can change things. You'll also note that our dimensions have changed. So if I go into my object data, my object properties, I should say, option here and open up the viewport display and turn on bounds, you'll see that this dimension is actually, again, describing the bounds because it's looking at the furthest extents of the cube and it's creating bounds around it. And so that's what this is describing now since we've applied that transformation. And this can be, of course, useful for certain things, but it can also be very confusing. So I'm just going to undo that with Control Z until we go back to a normal orientation. You can see that it's all reset. We can do the same thing with scale. So if we want a 1 by 1 by 1 cube, we can set those dimensions there and we can apply again with Control A or scale. And you can see now that it's a 1 meter cube instead of a 2 meter cube. Now this is really important. When we start to look at edit mode, we need to make sure that our transformations that we've done in object mode are applied, because it's very common that we come in here and we're going to scale things up and scale them down and rotate them. And if we don't apply those transformations, it's going to reference the original base transformations that the object had, and it's going to do things kind of weird. So I can kind of give you an example of that. So if I scale this cube up really largely, and let's skew it like this, let's scale it on the x-axis, and you don't have to do this at home. Again, just for those of you who are watching, you don't have to do this, just follow along on the screen and look at what I'm doing, and I'll explain things. So if I scale things to be strange like this, you can see my dimensions are all out of whack, and my scale is not proportional. If I try to do a certain operation in edit mode, so let's go to edit mode, and I'm just going to switch over to a specific mode that I'll describe soon, and I'll select the whole object, and I try to do a certain operation, you can see that it's not uniformly trying to do that operation. It's kind of squished and stretched, and you can see that it's not reacting in a predictable way, and that's not really what I want. So if I undo that and go back out into object mode and hit Control A and then apply that scale, and now I go back into edit mode and I do that operation, now it's acting more predictably where all of these edges that I'm creating now are more even. So this is an example of why it's important for us to apply our settings first before we try to make edits inside of edit mode, because it will behave unpredictably. So here, because I've undone that application, the applying of that scale, I can simply reset this down to a 1-to-1 ratio, and my cube goes right back to being a 1 meter cube because that's what we originally set. If I want to reset this to the basic 2 meter, I type in 2 and then I hit apply scale, and then now we're back to the default cube inside of Blender. So again, it's a lot of information that I've just thrown to you about transforming objects in 3D space and getting oriented and applying our transformations. So I'm going to cut the video here. I know that's been quite a bit of information to toss at you, so take a little bit of time to compartmentalize that and what it means. And then in the next video, we're going to jump right into edit mode and learning to edit sub-object components inside of Blender. So again, I hope this is helpful to you. If you do find it helpful and you like content like this and you want me to make more of it, hit that subscribe button and like the video. Share it with anyone else who you might think it would be useful for. And then, stay safe out there, of course, as always. And I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you later.